This meeting is now called to order.
The first.
We'll have the emergency announcement first. If I can get it started. I've not set that up. Okay. In the event of an emergency evacuation, an alarm may sound. Everyone should exit the building by way of the nearest stairwell in a safe and effective manner. If the nearest stairwell is blocked by smoke, use the other stairwell. Do not use the elevator. Once you have reached the main floor, follow the exit signs to exit the building and quickly proceed away from the building. Please be mindful of others evacuating and of emergency vehicles. The first item of business is the election of chairman. The floor is now open for nominations for chairman.
Do we need a roll call first?
I nominate Suzanne for chairman.
I'll second.
Okay. Are there any other nominations?
Move nominations be closed.
Okay. All in favor of closing nominations, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? There are none. And all those in favor of Suzanne as chairperson, say aye.
I abstain.
It's you. Okay.
Okay, our next order of business is to elect the vice chairman. Do I have a motion for vice chairman?
Move Lee Gowan be vice chairman.
Okay.
Move nominations be closed.
All in favor? All in favor of the nomination being closed?
Aye.
And then Katie, you take the vote.
Who made the motion? I've got to get
Ron.
Okay.
Seconded by Amy.
Okay. Okay. Now you can vote.
Now we have to vote on Lee, right?
You need to vote.
It won't let him vote.
Got that.
Okay. We'll just go on. Madam Chairperson, there are 5 yes votes.
Our next order of business is to have a motion on the setting of the agenda. Do I have a motion?
So moved, Madam Chair.
Do I have a second?
I second that.
All in favor can vote.
Voice vote aye. I vote aye.
Madam Chairperson, there are 5 yes votes.
Our next order of business is to have any discussion on the September 21st, 2017 Audit Committee minutes as presented in the packets. Is there any discussion before we have a motion? There being no discussion, do I have a motion on the floor to accept the minutes as presented?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second, Madam Chair.
All in favor?
Just 1 minute.
Aye.
There are 5 yes votes.
Okay, our next order of business on the agenda is any public input for items on the current agenda. Do I have anyone that wants to speak from the public tonight? Okay, there being no one from public input on the agenda, we'll move on to new business. And now we're going to turn the floor over to Mike Parton so he can present the audit report for Blount Memorial Hospital for the years ended June 30th, 2017 and June 2016.
Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you for allowing me to be here. I'm Mike Parton. I'm a CPA and the managing partner at Coulter & Justice, PC, based in Knoxville, Tennessee. We're a CPA firm. We've been here a number of years. I know a number of people by reputation and otherwise, so it's a pleasure to be here. Culture and Justice is the auditors for Blount Memorial Hospital. And just a recap, if you will, of how this relates. Blount Memorial Hospital is a separate legal entity, has its own board. It's presented in the county's financial statements each year as a discretely presented component unit. Now, I'm an accountant. I get to say that out loud, and it sounds like a big, long word, but what that means is in the county's annual financial statements, the hospital is presented in its own columns, and you've seen those in the past, and of course you see those each year. And then in the footnotes, the hospital has its own set of footnotes that are actually copied, if you will, or a duplicate of what's in the audit report that you have. It's presented as a discretely component unit because it's a separate legal entity and separately governed. The accounting and reporting rules for governmental entities provide for which units flow into the next primary government. And so since the hospital issues debt basically under the county's guidelines, it falls into the county and so on, if that makes sense. The county is audited by the state of Tennessee Comptroller of the Treasury. As the audit committee, you know that well. The Comptroller of the Treasury relies on our audit report in issuing their opinion. So each year when you see the audit report from the comptroller and as they're expressing an opinion on the county's financial statements, you'll see reference to the hospital and that they're relying on the work that we do. In conjunction with how we're engaged by the hospital, and it's a contract that is really a three-party contract, including the comptroller of the state of Tennessee. So we are contracted with the hospital and with the state by regulation as a number of things, but also in this case, it flows up to the county. So each year we make a number of routine communications with the comptrollers. We're independent, we're obviously engaged to do the work, and we're on schedule to complete our audit in advance of when the audit for the county needs to be completed. So that brings me to the audit for the fiscal year ending June 30, 2017. That audit was completed at the end of September, on schedule, on time. The audit report's been provided to the county and to the comptroller's office for use in the consolidation, if you will, of the county's financial statements, which will be issued, I believe, in December or shortly thereafter. The audit report that's been completed and been provided to the county and to the comptroller's office has a clean and unmodified opinion, so there's no modifications to the opinion, and the internal control and the compliance reports in the back of the audit have no findings. Other than that, I'm available for questions or comments that you may have.
Okay, just want to remind the committee before we open for questions what our job here to do with Culture and Justice is to determine their competence to do the audit, their completeness of the audit, and their independence of the audit. So I'm going to open the floor up for questions, and I'll start with Ms. Paganelli.
Is my mic on? So y'all have done this audit for how many years?
We've done this audit since the 1970s.
Okay. Under the property and equipment, it's actually under the other assets, there's a partnership interest note.
Yes.
But the note that it refers to talks about, I think, retirement plans.
Is this the fiscal year 17 report?
Yeah.
I noticed that too. I couldn't.
I didn't know if
Well,
maybe
it might be a typo, but hang on.
I didn't know if maybe a note had been taken out from last year.
Can you reference me to which page?
Page 22.
Okay. So on page 22, I'm looking at the footnotes to the financial statements, note 7, other assets.
Yeah, that partnership interest, note 11. And the note 11's on page 28, I think.
That is a reordering of the notes and a typo referencing note 11. If you'll bear with me.
I couldn't find anything on partnerships.
Each year, we will reshuffle and move certain aspects of the reporting.
So maybe there's just a missing note, maybe.
It's not a missing note. Maybe the reference is in the wrong place. We may have meant to reuse that for something different. That's the ambulatory surgery center.
Right.
If you'll bear with me, I believe that's in here, but I'm not sure which page.
Well, I think in previous audits, it had had its own note. Maybe it was,
Yeah, it should have been note 1. What you see there is note 11, should be note 1. There's an extra
I
number.
gotcha.
And
So
in
it's
note
in-
1 on page 13, there's a reference to the non-controlling interest in a partnership which operates a medical facility, and that references you back to note 7.
okay.
It's a typo, should be note 1, not note 11. My apologies.
Well, and the hospital's a 501c3, correct?
No, the hospital is a governmental entity organized separately in the state of Tennessee.
Is it like an instrumentality of the state, or?
It's got a special place the way it's been structured and organized. It's not a 501c3.
Okay, okay. So the fundraising organization that is a 501c3, how does it relate to this organization?
So there is a 501c3 that is presented in these financial statements as a part of the combined hospital entity. That's the Blount Memorial Foundation. It's a separate entity by 501c3 status, but it has a charter that has the Blount Memorial Hospital as its sole corporate member. And what that means in real terms is that the foundation is formed by and exists solely for the benefit of the hospital. So since it's formed by and exists solely for the benefit of the hospital, and since it's controlled by the hospital through its board of directors, it is in fact considered a part of the hospital, and it's included in the scope of our audit for the hospital.
So does that entity can it do things the hospital can't do, like fundraising, or is there something that it performs, or?
What it can do is act as a 501c3 entity and receive contributions and issue acknowledgments and support for people who make donations to the hospital. It can do charitable events and provide other things. Now, the hospital, as my understanding, can also do those things directly and can receive contributions. But there was a thought process over time that if you have a 501c3 entity, which is the normal organization for a nonprofit, that it's easier to issue those contribution acknowledgments, it's easier to fundraise, it's easier to say, contribute to our foundation for the charitable acts that we're, or support that we're doing, community benefit.
Yeah, okay. That's all I had, Suzanne.
How many hours do you spend on this audit?
That'll vary from year to year depending upon the transactions. If there's a new debt issue or something different, we'll spend more time than maybe other years. I don't have that number to give you an exact number, but I would tell you that it's somewhere between 500 and 700.
How many other hospitals do you audit?
In the context of each annual year, approximately 6.
The foundation is included in the audit, yet the way I understand it, you performed no audit procedures on the foundation for 10 years. Is that correct?
If I understand your question, you said for 10 years we did no audit procedures?
Yeah, because what I understand, the foundation didn't have an audit for 10 plus years, but the foundation financial statements are included in the hospitals. So my question is, in doing the audit of the hospital, you perform no procedures on the foundation?
Well, that's not exactly the way that this was worked. If you will, let me characterize. The foundation, as a separate legal entity, did for a number of years have a separate audit of just that entity with a separate report, and that was done through several years. For the last several years, the audit of the foundation has been included as part of the hospital audit, so it's not a separate opinion. To the extent that the foundation's activities and assets and liabilities were significant in relation to the work of the hospital, it would be included in our scope. A good example of that would be the investment balances, some of the other activity. So it's not accurate to say that no procedures were performed, but what is accurate to say is that the scope of the procedures was not the same as when it was a separate legal entity audit. So if you're auditing one entity and you're issuing a report on that one, you apply scopes at that level.
Why weren't they? Why weren't they? Why did it stop? I'm just curious.
Well, the audit had not been required. So when you look at a 501c3 entity in the state of Tennessee, audits are required for a charitable solicitation permit. The thresholds for that have to do with how much is being received. At some point in time, the foundation, as it was looked at, did not require an audit. This is around the time that the audits were no longer performed separately for the foundation. So it's not required by the state of Tennessee for the solicitations permit. So then the need for an audit is basically at the option of the governing board, or in this case, the governing board. So an audit wasn't required.
What's that threshold now for?
It was for a
dollars?
number of years, 500,000. I believe it's been moved to 750.
Yeah.
In annual receipts.
Yes, amount of receipts. Do you remember when it changed from 500 to 750?
I'd have to check.
Okay. Another question. Who found the theft? Did you all find it and report it to the board, or did somebody at the hospital find it and report it to you, or was it handled some other way?
In the conduct of our audit procedures for the fiscal year June 30, 16, we request many documents and many parts of evidence, as you might imagine. And we had made a number of requests. What we understand is the employee involved in the matter at the foundation that you're asking about, I believe, knew that we had requested or would request data, and went to their supervisor and disclosed the situation. We had not received that documentation back, but we had asked for documentation that we believe would have indicated what was occurring.
So was this documentation not asked for in the prior years?
It was not asked for in the prior years that we're aware of. In other words, we had never selected something that would have apparently caused this, not to our knowledge.
And say, just for instance, say you spent 600 hours on the audit, which I would have guessed 500 to 700. I would agree with that number. Of that 600 hours, how many audit hours would have been devoted to the foundation?
I can't give you a specific number because there are many general procedures that are done across everything related to the hospital. There are also specific procedures that would have been done toward individual accounts, and I wouldn't be able to give you that off the cuff. The foundation, if you look at it in terms of how much of the hospital's assets it represents, how much of the hospital's expenses, disbursements, and liabilities, it's a very small part of the hospital. It's a very, in this case, simple part of the operations, if you will. It's not as complex as other parts of the hospital. So it would have received a relatively smaller amount of time relative to its significance and perceived risk at that time.
That's all the questions I have for this moment. I may have some more a little bit later. Suzanne?
I'll turn it over to you for any additional questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to pursue Mr. Gowan's question about previous audits. Why, after 10-plus years, did you decide to ask these questions that led this person to believe that she was going to be caught? And what events happened that made you ask those questions and not ask them in the previous 9 or 10 years? I'm not an auditor. I'm not a CPA. I'm just plain old Ron. And to me, that doesn't make sense to me. why those questions weren't asked in the previous 10 years.
That's a very good question, so let me explain. And there are multiple parts to your question, so I'll break them down. The first question, as I understood it, was why did we ask those questions or request that documentation in the fiscal year 16 audit? The reason that we did so is that we were requested to expand the scope of the work we were doing to apply procedures at the foundation level. So in other words, we were requested to do audit procedures at the foundation entity level.
By whom?
By management of the hospital.
Pardon
and
me?
Management of the hospital and I understand the board.
Okay.
So the first part of the question is, why did we apply procedures more closely to the foundation in fiscal year 16? And it's because we were asked to expand the scope. My understanding of why we were asked to expand the scope is because it had been a number of years, and there was a desire to apply closer procedures to that separate element, if you will, of the hospital. That it goes to the answer to the second part, which is why over the number of years prior had we not audited at the lower materiality level. And the reason is the audit wasn't required, and the relative size and scope of the foundation's assets, liabilities, expenses, and revenues were very small in comparison to the entity. So it received, if you will, less direct testing because of its size and scope. And also, it's relatively simple in nature, not as complex as the other aspects of the hospital. The risk, if you will, in an organization audit is often related to how complex it is, what's going on. The foundation is relatively non-complex.
Just a comment, $186,000 is not small to me. I don't think it's small to Blount County and the people of this county. I don't understand that. In your audit of the 6 other hospitals, did they have foundations?
Well, with client confidentiality, I would really be restricted from commenting on the work that we do for other clients as to the nature of what they have or what we do. I've audited a number of foundations. It's something we have experience with as foundations. It's fairly common. This one is actually relatively simple.
I guess my question is it standard procedure when you audit the other hospitals, if they have foundations, not to audit those foundations? I mean, is that a standard practice?
In the state of Tennessee, if a foundation or a nonprofit entity, a 501c3 entity, meets the threshold, there are separate annual audits. If the nonprofit entity doesn't meet the threshold, then those audits aren't required. So we would audit at the level we would be requested to audit. So if there was a need for an audit or a perceived risk or issue, we might be engaged as any CPA would be engaged. I would say it's on a case-by-case basis as to whether or not nonprofit entities that aren't required to have audits have audits.
I have more, but I'll save them for a later time and let someone else.
I just want to make a quick comment before we move on from that about what you just said, and this is from my experience from serving on other boards, and it's just a comment. We have a due diligence for foundations and other nonprofit entities. I feel, as a public, to have those audited even though it may not be required. I know I serve on another board and we have no obligation. I don't serve, I work for them. And we have no obligation to have an audit, but out of due diligence to our very small community, we at a minimum have an audit intentionally to bring integrity to the table, and that's missing here. Turn it over to Andy Allen for questions.
I just have one that a lot of questions and answers happened so far, but just so I'm straight, the only way this was discovered was because management asked for the auditor to go above and beyond the required duties. Is that correct? That's what I've gathered out of everything you've said.
What I can say is that we were conducting procedures at a low level relative to that activity, and in the conduct of those procedures, we believe we requested information, or we know we requested information that would have indicated an issue.
But you would not have requested that information normally. Somebody asked you to request that level of detail.
We may have requested that information normally, depending upon the work that we were doing and how we might have selected tests. There was no indicator of which I'm aware that there was a risk or an issue. There were controls in place and there were procedures to safeguard assets. This particular situation was a very limited one. It had one account, one issue. Once again, if you have controls and procedures are operating as you expect, hopefully that would prevent and detect timely.
That's all I have, Suzanne. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? So did the foundation I guess it had a separate bank account?
Yes.
And so were the controls the same? And what I don't have a handle on is the staffing of the foundation. Was there the separation of duties for the deposits and the expenditures, and were those things run through the infrastructure of the hospital, or did the foundation have its own, or does it have its own?
It was a combination of both. Part of the functions were run through the hospital and some of the functions were separate in the foundation. The foundation, once again, has limited activity, relatively few events, not a lot in terms of the way of activity. And so some of that activity was through the hospital's primary systems and some of that activity was separate through its separate bank account.
And I know as the auditors, I probably shouldn't ask you this question, but do you see a reason for the hospital to have such a separate entity? Does it?
The hospital can do many things as a governmental entity, and I believe, in my understanding of why the foundation was situated separately or created separately, was to allow it to have that 501c3 nonprofit status so that for the fundraising,
Right.
it would be like other fundraising entities as a foundation as opposed to the hospital.
I just know where I work, a lot of people try to set up separate entities to do the things their parents won't let them do.
I don't believe that's the case here, to my understanding.
Okay. No.
Okay, I just have a few clarifications, and then I'll open it back up if anybody has any more questions. I understand from reading the newspaper and reading the audit report and from what you just said, Mike, that the last audit of the foundation was which year? The full audit of just the foundation?
The separate audit and report for the foundation was in fiscal year 2007.
I find it strange that that's the year the theft started. Was the person who stole aware there would no longer be an audit? Or is it ironic, just a big coincidence, that they began that year stealing and every year since then?
I can't speak to what that employee was aware of or when.
They weren't notified. So there would have been no correlation for them to have been privy to the knowledge that they would no longer be audited and they had free rein to take money.
I can't speak to what that employee knew or when in 2007. I don't know.
But it's not something that would have been at a board meeting they would have been present at.
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. A little further, and this is going from the 9/12/2016 opinion from Culture and Justice. It says, as of the date of our report, the hospital's management informed us that they are investigating potential unauthorized disbursements made by a hospital employee. Based on the information available at this time, our report on the financial statements in this report are not otherwise affected by this manner. I'm trying to get my arms around that because I thought that you were saying that they came to you during that time. How, and I may have misunderstood, but I thought they came to you and then this report was released when it was still being investigated. Is that correct or not?
So we were aware, due to the timing of when the employee went to their supervisor and indicated what the situation was. And we were able to be involved and look at the information as it came together and be able to assess whether we had enough evidence at that time to have the report be complete in terms of the hospital audit. That's not to imply that the investigation was complete on the day of our report. There were other procedures done and other work done, and the expansion was done after that date. But as of that date, we had quite a bit of information, if you will, about what had occurred, how it occurred, what the exposure and risk were to other potential loss. We had a lot of information at that date.
So you requested the information, and when you did the request during this audit, during the 2016 audit, you requested information from this person, and they turned themselves in, or how did it come to be?
We requested information during the audit. They self-reported, if you will, or reported to their supervisor what had been occurring.
When?
August 30th is my understanding of the date.
And how did it come about that you began doing fraud investigation, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, and how did you move from this clean audit to looking at the impropriety?
Anytime you have an incident like this occur in the middle of an audit, if you will, you immediately expand the procedures that you're doing so that you have enough evidence to understand the scope, nature, and other risk exposures relative to the loss. So that was done immediately upon notification. We began to look at the information and work with the hospital staff on what was being accumulated and what was being gathered. There was a lot of work that was done very quickly, and then there was a lot of work that was done over a period of weeks to ensure that this truly had been reviewed and determined and examined, if you will, to make sure that what we had or what the hospital had was complete.
Just to further clarify, because some of you others may be familiar with this, but when you find fraud as the auditor, your obligation, or you're notified of it, your obligation is to contact the comptroller's office since you're contracted through them. How does that process work, and what time frame are we looking at? When did we have this dollar amount? When did we know this, the 186?
So there's two parts to the question. What is the process and when did we have the dollar amount? So the process that's determined, the state of Tennessee has an audit manual that specifies a number of different aspects, but it's also explicitly in the contract to audit. The state comptroller is very serious about making sure that auditors, when they find something like this, ensure that it's communicated. So that communication was done both with a phone call and with written communication to the comptrollers to communicate what we had. And then the information relative to the amount, I believe just prior to the date of our audit report, the amount had been accumulated and relatively well substantiated at that time, although there was other work done post that date to make sure that there was no other amounts that had been lost.
What determined how far back in time you went? Why did you stop at 2007, or did you go further?
We went as far as records were available and as far as the information indicated. And so if you look at the trends in terms of what occurred here as amounts by year, and if you go all the way back into the detail and you look at the activity in terms of the number of checks and the amounts of the checks and how it accumulated, all of the evidence that we had and all the information we had indicated that it had started in 2007. And we also know that just given the audit tests that were done in 2007 and prior, the tests that are done would have generally been something that would have detected, assuming that one of those transactions came up. Once again, if you look back at the trend, it started off very small and very limited, and then it grew over time. So I don't believe that the risk of anything prior to 2007, based upon all the evidence that we have, I believe that's a very, very small risk that occurred. It may have occurred.
Okay. So it was a risk assessment module you applied and determined it wasn't necessary to go back further.
Based on all the evidence that we had.
Because she began employment in 2001, if the papers are correct.
That's my understanding.
Okay. Can you speak to the nature, because another part that this audit committee is charged with is assessing that internal controls are in place at the component unit in this situation, at the organizations. And this kind of fraud you just said checks speaks to the fact that potentially there may not be internal controls in place, because this wasn't just 1 year. This was a long period of time. So can you speak to that and explain what internal controls were in place and how you were able to move to a clean opinion that, that it was sufficient, that the internal controls were sufficient?
So what you have in this situation where we have the loss through the unauthorized disbursements is you have one opportunity in the internal control system that was not previously known. And when I say not previously known, had anyone been aware that that internal control over the bank account reconciliation and review had been such that it did not detect this particular type of disbursement, that would have been closed. So what I'm saying is there was one crack in that internal control that allowed this to occur over this period of time. It's the same type of transaction, it's the same manner and method, and it just varies slightly by amount, by year, and by, it really doesn't vary much other than by amount and by year. So it's the same opening or opportunity, if you will, that was in the internal control that no one was previously aware of. Had they been aware, obviously something would have been done to address that, but.
Does the hospital not have means in place independent of your organization to look at internal controls and really look over what's going on?
So yeah, they do, and that's what I'm referring to. I'm not talking about what we do as auditors. Mm-hmm. The first line of responsibility for any organization, government or other, is to have controls in place to protect the assets and to timely detect and prevent. That's the general purpose. The auditors come by afterwards and do a number of different things. In this particular case, there were internal controls relative to the account and how those activity, if you will, was being handled. But what I'm saying is that within those internal controls, there was an element of that that was not functioning as designed. And because of that particular element, this went undetected. I believe if that element had been functioning, it would have been detected or prevented. Once again, no one was aware that the functioning of that element of the control was not in effect at that time.
And Culture and Justice didn't view that as a break in or weakness. There can be internal controls in place, but they're weak and they're not evaluated. And I guess that, you know, I understand having things in place, but somebody has to be Big Brother and look over their shoulder. So in 9 years, nobody played Big Brother. Even if there are internal controls in place, somebody has to come in and go, yes, they're working right, or no, they're not. And it's hard for me to understand how nobody looked in 9 years at that.
So internal control weaknesses are evaluated along a number of criteria. If you don't know the weakness exists because you're not aware that it's not functioning, you're not going to note it.
Because you're not looking.
Or not testing at the level where it's that amount. Once you have an internal control weakness that you identify, then you assess relative to the organization as a whole what the exposure is and what the opportunity for loss is. The reason this is significant, the reason this is a significant amount is because it's smaller amounts taken over years as to why it adds up to what it does.
That's all the questions I have at this time. Ron, I think you have some more.
Thank you. I want to pursue our chairman's line of question, and I too was perturbed by the statement on the report about, as of the date I report, the hospital's management informed us that they're investigating potential unauthorized disbursements made by a hospital employee. Based on the information available at this time, I report on the financial statements and this report are not otherwise affected by the matter. I guess I need the process of conducting an audit explained to me, if during the process of conducting an audit, you're made aware of a fraudulent situation, does the audit stop at that time and you just put out a blank statement like that? Or do you not investigate the information before you release the audit? That doesn't make sense to me. If you're conducting an audit and you find a discrepancy, should that discrepancy not be pursued before the audit is released? I don't know. And I'm a member of a small board of directors also, and we're a 501c3. Mm-hmm. We're not required to have an audit, but as our chairman said, we have an audit every year, even though it costs us a little money, and we handle the public's money. That's why we have it, to do due diligence, because if we don't, we're the ones that are going to be responsible for that. But I'm curious about the conduct of this audit, why it stopped and this statement was issued and nothing was pursued. And after that line of question, I've got a few more. After you answer that one, I don't understand that.
So there are many aspects of an audit, and the audit, for all of the normal aspects continued, there is a reporting responsibility to the county, to the state, to complete the audit. We did get information, we did get evidence, we did expand the scope of our procedures to have sufficient evidence as of the date of our report to believe that we understood the scope and magnitude of the loss, how it occurred. So I believe that the evidence that we had at the time of that report, and we had conducted a number of additional scope procedures at that time. So to say that we had not done anything is not accurate. So we had done a number of tests and reviewed the information, and we felt comfortable on the date of our report that we had sufficient evidence for the report on the hospital. Now, in that language of that statement, if something had come up later, if there had been some discovery at some point in time that there was something else that we didn't expect or see at that time, then we might have had to have gone back and modified our report and reissued it under a later date. But for the purposes of that report on the hospital as a whole, we felt like we had enough evidence at the date of that letter to issue that report relative to this issue.
In your statement, you mentioned responsibilities to the county. Madam Chairman, may I ask the mayor a question?
Yes, you may, Mayor, you have the floor.
Mayor, were you made aware of this discrepancy when it happened?
I was not.
How would that be responsible to the county? If the county wasn't made aware of it? And my next question is, was the board of directors made aware of this discrepancy? Are any of the members of the board of directors here? I'd like to ask them a question or two.
Do we have any members from the board present?
Yeah, I know you, Mr. Hyman. I recognize your face. But you can't speak for the board of directors. I'd like to talk to, you can't say what answer my question for them.
I can answer the question about was the board of directors involved or no.
Were they made aware of these findings?
They were made aware immediately. They asked every question and more that all of y'all have asked during the investigation, and they were aware of it. I regret not calling the mayor. One of the things that was a mistake I made. I should have called the mayor. Did that. We were engrossed in. I was shocked by what we found. We immediately were doing an investigation. We had the auditor do the follow-up investigation. We
So you created an internal audit committee on the board?
No, sir, the board oversees the audit from the beginning to the end, and Mike reports to the board regarding the audit.
Are the members of the hospital board the same members on the foundation board? Did the foundation have a board?
When it was originally founded, it had a separate board. I can't remember the date, I don't have it in front of me. At some point, it was restructured so that the hospital board was the same board.
Has there been any discussion of creating a separate board again for the foundation? I mean,
No, sir, most of the discussion was what went wrong and what controls we need to put in place so it can never happen. That was more of the focus at the time of the founding than to create a separate board. We had a separate board, it was difficult. Part of my understanding was it was difficult to maintain and recruit the board. The decision at some point was made that they restructured it and made the board of the hospital board. That was before me being CEO, but that was my understanding of why they did that.
I would think that one of the controls that could be initiated would be a separate board. Or create an audit committee within the board. Create your own audit committee. Let them take a look at the situation. Obviously, the board didn't, or I'm not speaking for the board. The board's not here. But I would think that it's a conflict of interest to have the same board for the hospital and the foundation. That, to me, I think is a conflict of interest.
Are you finished?
Pardon?
Are you finished? Amy's going to take it.
Go ahead, Amy, jump in.
I'll go back to my same point. It seems to me if they do have the same board, that they're really not separate entities. So why not have it all under one entity if the hospital can do friend and fundraising and host events, and that's just my point.
Is there any reason they could not be, based on your information you know about it, Mike?
I'd want to research that further to see if there's any aspect of what they're doing now with the 501c3 that wouldn't fit under the government umbrella. But I would defer that to the hospital board, who's charged with governing both the hospital and the foundation. So,
Any further questions, Amy?
No,
Oh,
that's all.
Dawn? Dawn, come up. Let's put you up here with Mike. Yeah. Well, we can hear you better.
When the hospital was formed in 1947, there was no such thing as 501c3. It wasn't an IRS code at the time. So the corporation it's actually a private, not-for-profit corporation formed to run the hospital. When the decision was made to start a foundation, there was a couple reasons. At the time, there was restrictions on what the hospital could do, the hospital corporation, including and I just don't have the date in front of me, so I'm just grabbing out of the air here. I just remember the discussion. The hospital, up until I believe in the 90s, was not able to hold stocks and bonds, for example, in our portfolio. A law was passed after that allows us to do that now. So now in our investments, we have an investment committee that oversees all the investments of the hospital. At the time, we couldn't, though. So the 501c3 was a way to raise money, and any funds that they collected over time, they could invest in stocks and bonds that previously that couldn't have been done under the hospital. So that's why it was originally formed. Since then, that requirement's gone away. The board has an investment committee that oversees all the investments of the hospital. So, and they report to the finance committee. They oversee the hospital's investments, and they also oversee the investments of the foundation. So the majority of the funds that the foundation manages is overseen by the board through that. The main thing that was the problem here was basically the checking account for the foundation. The 2007 date, the last audit that was done in 2007, the foundation had a paper checkbook. It still was doing paper checks. There's actually a recommendation to install QuickBooks electronic to have better controls. That was when the theft started. That's the only place in our organization where we have QuickBooks, and the employee found a way around that to.
Can you speak to
do
that, what they were doing?
I believe it was in the investigation report that we gave to the paper and to the comptroller's office. Basically, the person was going into QuickBooks, writing a check to themselves, printing it, and they found a way they could go back into QuickBooks and make an amendment to change who the check was written to, and they would use any standard vendors that we normally use. So the printout would end up showing it looked like a check was sent to whoever, whatever, any of our normal vendors or Home Depot or whatever. And it looked like on the list that it was done legitimately. She found a loophole around that to be able to go back in and edit who the check was written to. So all the data that we were looking at looked normal.
And you have no image statements with your bank statements?
Excuse me?
No images of the checks that were written that went with the bank statements?
I think
Nobody's
later they
signing?
found-
Typically, in the situation, it's typical to have fraud in QuickBooks like you just described. It's standard across the board that when you have QuickBooks, you have this problem. So it is standard from what I have seen in my very limited experience of having someone look over those bank statements and look at an image of each and every check to make sure that right there doesn't happen. Is there an internal control in place at this time that will prevent that? Do you have someone else looking at a QuickBooks generated?
Obviously what we've done, we've gone farther than that. We've basically taken away anywhere else in the hospital system, including me. If I request a check, I have to request a check request form that goes to our accounting department, and accounting department has all the controls in place and gets audited at discrete levels. That was the only place that had QuickBooks. So now what's going on in the foundation is they have to request a check from the accounting department just like any other department in the hospital. That was definitely a weakness that went back to when they had was originally formed and was just started out. So we basically taken that away. There's the investment funds are managed by the board and a professional. We use Fidelity and PYA Waltman that oversee all that and any transfers or movement. So the foundation employees have no access to our funds, and the check writing now has basically been taken away from the foundation. It has to go through the normal hospital system through that process. So we're not doing that. That whole procedure is not even there anymore.
But for 9 years, was she the sole signature on the account?
Excuse me?
Was she the only person required to sign checks for the foundation?
Yes,
or did
I
she
believe so.
forge a signature? So
I believe
in my
so.
mind, there are not controls in place. Dual signatures are required.
I think what was being audited, the materiality, they were only going, when they were checking every year, they were going down a certain amount. What changed this year, they went down to a lower amount and caught 3.
But at no point were dual signatures required. So she had full authority to write checks and
I
be
believe so.
for over at least 9 years.
I believe so.
I strongly recommend any nonprofit that I work with that they, hands down, no questions asked, on a certificate of deposit or any investment account, that 2 signatures are required. That is the very best you can do, but at no point is it ever okay. I view it as a breach and an internal control. At any time, there's only 1 signature required because that means 1 person can steal. And that's exactly what happened here. And I think it could have been prevented based on what's described here. I hope that's going to be in place moving forward on all bank accounts, and that someone is actually looking over the bank statements and looking at images, especially it's different in private, but we have an obligation and a due diligence when we handle other people's money. The foundation's money does not belong to the hospital. It is money that was given for a purpose. And I feel like we violate that when we don't put all the internal controls and policies and procedures in place to protect their money and what it was intended for. And that's all I have at this point.
Rector, she had the authority to pay bills for the hospital. I mean, is that what she was doing? Or for
For the foundation.
she had the authority to write the check, she had the authority to write the check for foundation to pay
For the
for
foundation.
a bill that may have come in.
Yes. and it
From
was-
a
it was-
vendor or
it was the
whatever.
It was the only place in our system where we had a separate account or a separate, in the QuickBooks system. We didn't have that anywhere else.
And
Is she the only employee
There were 3 or 4 employees for the
that are
foundation.
truly just part of the foundation? That are part of the foundation?
Yes, we've got a few employees that manage, that do grant work, and then there was a administrative assistant and her and one other person. So there was 3 mainly in the foundation.
But payroll services and accounts payable, did the hospital handle those
Hospital
things,
does all the payroll.
purchasing?
All of them are on the hospital payroll.
Okay.
And these checks, I assume, were written over a period of time. In other words, take 2015, $32,558. I assume she wrote several checks throughout the year, which that...
Yes.
Okay.
It was mainly small amounts that added up to that.
Got one last question, maybe. If you have an employee, LPN possibly, an RN, it's just a theoretical situation, and they're taking drugs from the pharmacy illegally, and they've been doing it for some time. I'm curious, is it the policy of the hospital not to prosecute those people?
Every case.
If they're taking drugs, would you give them the opportunity to make restitution and slap them on the hand and say, go on? I don't understand. And who made the decision not to prosecute, I guess? And I don't know the lady you were talking about from Adam. I couldn't even tell you her name right now. I've read it in the papers and I've read it in the reports, but I don't understand that, the mentality there.
You've asked a couple different questions. I'll address the first one
Okay.
first. Every employment matter is individualized, and because we're a hospital, we've got different requirements to different agencies. So we do from time to time, if we've got a nurse that we've found that's been taking drugs out of the drug cabinet, we have to report that to the Board of Nursing, and we have to go through a procedure to do that. If it's a physician, you've got to report it to the Tennessee Medical Foundation. There's a whole procedure you have to go through that to allow them opportunity to have rehab and those kinds of things. So I think it always depends on the situation and the gravity of it. And it's kind of an individual decision on each time. I think in this case, I'll address the second part of the question. The board made the decision about where we stood on it. Ultimately, the Attorney General makes a decision on whether to press charges or not us. He did ask our opinion. Because she came forward, because she cooperated with the investigation, and because she promptly paid all the money back with interest, I think our board debated it just like here. They had a healthy discussion about this and debated it back and forth about what we should press to do. And I think probably the most important part was to get the money back with interest, because just like was commented before, a lot of people give money to the foundation, including myself, including most of my board members, and we wanted to be able to make the foundation whole on those gifts so they could be used what they're supposed to be used for. The work of the foundation, I think there was a comment made about what the purpose of the foundation. The purpose of the foundation is not to help the hospital. It was formed to help patients who don't have resources to help. So our foundation right now is paying for gas vouchers to people who can't come get their radiation treatments. We pay utility bills. for folks that have to choose between utility bills and their medicine. We've given rides and paid for medicine for people on hospice that can't afford to do it. So I think the board was just focused on, they wanted to get to the bottom of it. They wanted to put controls in place that never happen again. They wanted to get all the money back plus interest to be made whole. And their focus at that point was to move forward with our mission and doing what we're supposed to do. The Attorney General asked, what he said to us was, I generally look at the victim and say, what do you want us to do? And at that point, we were not pressing to press charges. We wouldn't stand in the way if he wanted to, but at that point, the hospital's priorities had been met in terms of getting the money back, fixing the weaknesses that we had in the foundation accounting, and to move forward. So that was the discussion that took place, and why they decided that wasn't their top priority, is to do that.
Okay. I've got no more questions, but just a final statement. When I first came on the commission in Blount County, I had, from my community, several comments about the hospital, and they weren't very nice about the comments. In the last 12 to 15 years, the hospital has made unbelievable strides in patient care, in the professional and the professional doctors and the nurses that they've hired. They have come 180 degrees, in my opinion, based on since I've been here, and I hate that this gives the hospital a black eye. I just hate that. Hopefully, and it doesn't reflect on any of the people that work there, doesn't anything. I think it reflects on the internal controls and possibly the board. That being said, I want to speak about the county. The county's worked hard in doing their due diligence and being transparent in what we've done over the last 6 to 8 years. I think we've worked hard. I think all the office holders have worked hard to make Blount County transparent to the people that we're responsible for. And I would hope that these people don't hold the county responsible for this. I would hope that somehow the newspaper makes our citizenship aware of that. It was not the county. The county has been transparent, and we've worked hard to do that. And this has given us a black eye also.
Well, just to comment on that, as a member of the community, I don't think it reflects on the county. I think it reflects back on the hospital and how they conducted themselves in this matter, and not onto the county. Do we have other members who have other comments? Okay, Lee, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Just a couple of quick questions for Mike, because we're running out of time, but this is important. Who at the hospital was responsible for reviewing the bank reconciliations of the foundation every month?
I don't have that person's name in front of me right now. My understanding is there was a process for review of those reconciliations. And to the point about this, the check images or canceled checks, apparently those were not noted or not addressed in that review, or they were not there. So that's the crack that I mentioned that allowed this opportunity to occur. And I realize you're very concerned about internal controls, but what we're talking about here is one account that was outside the scope of the normal hospital operations, very unique in the way it operated because it was smaller and had a certain activity. And I believe everyone thought that there were internal controls in place in review of that bank reconciliation to ensure that that would have been prevented or detected. And unfortunately, in this case, that part was not functioning. And you already, as an accountant and CPA, you know exactly what I'm referring to. That part wasn't functioning. Had that part been functioning, I don't think we'd be here today discussing this topic. And so I don't think that necessarily relates to everything else that the hospital does or their internal controls. I think it's very unique and narrow, and it's very disappointing to see that someone realized that that was there and took advantage of it. And took advantage of it in ways that would be not very easily detected, could occur over a long period of time, and that's really embarrassing. Obviously, everybody tries to do it right and get it right, but things do happen in the real world, and this is one of them.
Do you know who the person was responsible for the review of the reconciliations, Ms. China? Who was responsible? Earlier it was said that there was a person in the hospital whose job was to review the reconciliations of the foundation every month. My question is, who was that person? Because they did not do their job. Wasn't that said earlier? Am I wrong? Wasn't that what was said earlier?
He said that they reconciled the checking account, yeah.
Yeah, he's saying that reconciliation on that account was with that person in the foundation.
But earlier, okay, that contradicts what was said earlier. One of you guys earlier said that someone in the hospital was reviewing the reconciliations.
Yeah, what I'm referring to is the information was being reviewed. It was not being reviewed as to those canceled checks coming through.
Well, who was doing that review?
That was a 9-year period. I'm not sure. I don't have the answer to that question.
Can you get us that answer?
I can I can get an answer for that question.
My second question is, well, let me hold off on the second one. If anybody else has another one before me, I don't want to take up all the time. No, I'm sorry. Let me address this. Who did the investigation? Did Culture and Justice do the investigation, or did the comptroller? Because I've seen it done both ways. Sometimes the comptroller wants to swoop in and they do their thing, and then sometimes they farm it out to the accounting firm.
Yeah, the comptroller's office has the authority to do the investigation directly or to allow the CPA firm or another outside party to do it. In this particular case, we communicated what we had and what the plan was, and we communicated a number of times. The comptroller's office reviewed both what we had as well as the plan, and decided to let us continue with the expansion of our scope and the work that we did. And then we were in contact with them from the beginning on the notification to as the work developed and also when we concluded.
So this was really done as a separate engagement, per se. Our contract with the comptroller said the comptroller said you guys go ahead and do the investigation.
The comptroller said we could do the investigation, and then they wanted status reports and then a report at the end to make an ultimate determination if they wanted to do anything beyond.
And were there additional fees charged by your firm for doing this investigation?
We did.
I think at this time that we probably need to adjourn for further discussion as a committee at a future meeting. Let's.
In the form of a motion, I would like to. I've got three. I want to do them separately. My first recommendation is that the Memorial Foundation has an annual audit every year going forward, and that audit is performed by a different firm that does the hospital audit. I'll make that in the form of a motion.
Do I have a second for the motion?
I'll second the motion.
Let's vote. Okay.
Suzanne, what exactly are we recommending this? What are we voting?
We're recommending.
We are recommending to commission,
Yes, recommend to commission.
and we'll have a repeat of the motion once Gay gets it typed in for us. Do you care to read it?
And my computer screen's no longer working. Oh, sorry.
The MH Foundation has an annual audit by a separate firm.
Repeat that. Can you do that?
Lee, can I amend that motion
Certainly.
and say that that board needs to be appointed by the same people that appoint the hospital board? Would that be
Yeah.
appropriate?
I was going to make a similar motion to that in a minute,
Okay.
but that's fine if you want to
We'll
wait.
keep
Do that as a separate.
We'll keep it as separate motions.
All right, so the motion is that, to recommend that the Blount Memorial Foundation has an annual audit by a separate firm.
Yes.
And we have a second by Ron, and we're ready to vote.
Yes.
He says yes.
You have 5 yes votes.
Motion carries. Next order of business, Lee.
I would also like to make a motion that the foundation has a separate board of directors, and in separate, I mean different from the board of the hospital. No one could be on the same board.
Do I have a second?
I'll second that motion also.
We'll let Gay repeat this one also before we take it to a vote.
That the foundation has a separate board of directors from the hospital.
Is there any further discussion?
No one board member can serve, but
Yes.
that was the second part.
Any further discussion? Everybody can vote.
You have 5 yes votes.
Motion carries. Lee, do you have anything
I
else?
have one more, and I'll be quiet. I would also like to make a recommendation that the hospital looks at different auditors for the next year and takes proposals, or RFPs as they're called, for auditors. Coulter Justice has done the audit 30 or 40 years. It may be time to look. I'm not saying change. I'm saying look at some other auditors and their qualifications. That's a long time for one firm to do an audit. And my second part of that recommendation is that this audit committee has input on who is chosen to be the auditors.
Do I have a second for Lee's motion? You do. Amy, you second that? Did I
Yes,
hear
I
you
second
correctly?
that.
Okay. We have a second. Let's let Gay repeat it after she types it. Do we have any discussion before we take it to a vote?
Okay, made the recommendation that Blount Memorial Hospital use a different audit firm and that the audit committee has input on the audit firm chosen.
And we're ready.
Excuse me, that's not exactly right. I said that they look at changing auditors and take proposals, take some RFPs and proposals. I'm not saying they have to change. I mean, I don't have that authority, but I'm saying I want to look at some
Options.
other auditor options and that we have input on that selection.
Okay.
Will you read it for us one more time?
All right, make the recommendation that Blount Memorial Hospital use a different audit firm, perhaps look at other audit options, and that the audit committee has input on the audit firm chosen.
I think
Is that
that's the
closer?
first, the whole first sentence needs to go away. He's not recommending a different audit.
No.
He's just recommending that
We look.
do the RFP process and that we have input on their decision.
That's correct.
RFP process?
Request for proposal.
Request for
Look
proposal.
at, not use, but look at.
Okay. And we clean these up when we listen to the tapes again. Okay. Is that look right now?
We know the intent.
There.
You guys have meetings.
That's correct. Let's repeat it one more time.
Make the recommendation that BMH look at an RFP process to select the next audit firm and that the audit committee has input on the audit firm chosen. Close? Good.
Any more discussion? We're ready to take it to a vote.
You have 5 yes votes.
Motion carries. Is there any further business for tonight? There being no further business, do I have a motion that we adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Meeting adjourned.